Order. I call Mr Bob Seeley to move the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. I beg to move that the House has considered the provision of healthcare on English islands. May I first say, sir, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the Speaker's Office for granting this debate, and indeed for the Minister for coming to respond. To be very brief, initially, I'm going to outline three arguments. Firstly, why I believe that the Isle of Wight remains underfunded in its health services compared to the mainland. This underfunding, my trust believes, ranges from £5 to £8 million just for acute services. Secondly, I will ask why the Isle of Wight is the only English island, indeed UK island, separated by sea without NHS subsidised travel. I believe this is deeply unfair to my constituents. Thirdly, I want to suggest ways that we can help the Department of Health and Social Services to deliver better health and social care on the island through the creation of a single public services authority for local government and health, and for the island, as it has done in the past, to become a national leader in how to improve government services by combining. By way of background, Mr Speaker, I'll start by paying tribute to the island's NHS staff who do a wonderful job of delivering NHS healthcare provision. We value greatly their professionalism and their dedication. And I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the island's NHS leadership in the Clinical Commissioning Group and in the Trust, and Maggie Oldham and Vaughan Thomas for their work specifically. Along with the wider teams, they do a very challenging job in difficult circumstances, and I'm hugely grateful for their work and the work of everybody who works in both our health services, medics, ambulance, and indeed our public services. I've called this debate both as member for the Isle of Wight and as chairman for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for UK Islands. The purpose of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Islands is to promote the needs of island communities within Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and to advocate their economic and social well-being, the provision of high-quality and accessible public services and affordable transport arrangements, which is particularly pertinent to the island that I have the privilege of representing. And the issues that I'm raising today are, I believe, directly focused on those. Today's subject follows on from earlier debates that myself or the APPG have called, both looking at the economies of UK islands and the issue of public services for UK islands as well. Now, due to devolution, this debate is largely focused on English islands, which is primarily the Isle of Wight, has a population of approximately 140,000, and the much smaller Scilly Isles, which has a population, I believe, of about 1,500. As I previously raised, there are additional costs associated with providing public services in island communities. The University of Portsmouth has issued a peer-reviewed report showing that the extra costs of providing local government services on the Isle of Wight is some £6.4 million a year. Now, this coincidentally is similar to the amounts of money that Orkney gets, that Shetland gets, and the Western Island gets, despite having much smaller populations. These principles work for healthcare provision as well, and I believe there are significant additional costs to providing services on the Isle of Wight. As I said, we have a population of just over 140,000, 143,000. This is half the size that you would normally have for a district general hospital. So clearly, we are very grateful to have that hospital and that district general hospital and not that great staff. But what it means is, for the island, because our helicopters don't fly 24 hours a day, and because sometimes the ferries don't go at night, we need a maternity unit. Women cannot give birth in a helicopter. We need paediatrics. We need A&E. So our funding is skewed naturally and obviously by our environment. And because of that, there is an argument to suggest that we are unable to fund properly some of the other services we need. The other problem with that is that if we are paying for a consultant's expertise, and that consultant is full-time on our trust's books, and effectively we're using that consultant 3 days a week, or that maternity consultant is not used to his full capacity, because although we need a maternity unit, it's not as active as the average District General Hospital's maternity unit. Those consultants are not getting the required hours on their ticket, to put it in layman's terms. And so we have the diseconomies of scale caused by that. Now, one of the answers is to work much more closely with Southampton and Portsmouth, and that is absolutely critical to our future, and that is going to be happening. Our costs are also exacerbated by the demographic profile of the Isle of Wight residents. We have a lot of young people, as the Isle of Wight Festival proved, but we also have 24% of our population over 65, and that will increase. And as a point that we were just discussing before the debate, I think there is an argument to suggest that over 80s, the funding for over 80-year-olds is not generous enough within the NHS because of the more focused health requirements of people in those advanced ages. And because we have a fair chunk of our population over 80, we have significant pressures. We also have double the number of average per constituency cases of dementia. We have about 2,700 residents living with dementia. As I say, double the national average. We are experiencing a growing financial challenge. Our CCG is 19 million above its target funding. The island overall receives 233 million to fund its healthcare services. The CCG and the Trust are seeking to make 19.1 million savings this year, which will still leave cost pressures. The rise in our funding has been marginal compared to the rise in funding in other trusts and CCGs elsewhere in the UK. And I now think that very small raises in funding or rise in funding is having a very negative effect, and I would appreciate the Minister looking closely at that. Financial modelling undertaken as part of the acute services redesign shows that even with reconfiguring services to the maximum extent, there will still be a gap in the cost of funding for the island's population and the amount of money that the NHS receives. Now, our trust believes that costing, even with the most ambitious plans that we have, is somewhere between 5.3 and 8 million pounds, and that's just on the delivery, if I understand correctly, of acute services. So, the first thing I'd like to suggest, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister is that we look and that the Minister accepts that there are additional costs associated with providing these services on the island. This is not a case of special pleading, but it is merely to accept that we have exceptional circumstances in the structure of our healthcare on the island by dint of being an island separated from the mainland. We can build us a fixed link at a cost of about 3 billion, or we can argue about the extra millions that we need properly to fund the NHS. I do strongly welcome the recent announcements by his colleague, the Secretary of State, of a new long-term funding plan for the NHS, which is a clear sign of our party's commitment to ensuring that the NHS continues with its world-class provision. But I want to make sure that some of that funding comes my way, and I would be very grateful for the Minister to discuss this and to continue this conversation, and for him to meet with our island NHS leadership so that he can understand and his officials can understand in detail the extra costs. But I also want to propose a way that we can, on the island, work more effectively with the integration of public services, which I hope is an idea that would be attractive to the Minister and to his officials. As I say, we're not looking for special treatment, but we are looking for fairer funding. And I place the emphasis on both provision and access because I understand that we want to provide most services as possible, as much services as possible on the island, but we also need access to the mainland for when some of our people some of our islanders need to go to Southampton or Portsmouth for treatment. Specialist services, radiotherapy, which is provided on the mainland, and there is going to be a small rise in the number of visits to, well, it's actually going to be a small decrease in the number of visits to the mainland, but there'll be a small rise in the number of more specialised healthcare appointments that go to the mainland. As he may know, there are a series of options laid out by the NHS Trust over the future of healthcare on the Isle of Wight, and I would seek government support for the more ambitious aims, which would take more sort of bread and butter acute services, to put it like that, back to the island, and to actually have fewer trips to the mainland, rather than the current option, which is to see slightly less services coming back to the island and slightly more going to the mainland, but we will discuss that at length. The local care finance system has undertaken some detailed work assessing how the appropriate balance is struck between providing services within the shores of the island and enabling access. However, and there is of course the risk of increased patient safety associated with any shift of more services to the mainland, particularly where patients may be frail and needing swift access to services. My constituents have made it very clear through a range of public engagement exercises that we wish to see the maximised retention of services on the island, and they join me in asking the government to ensure that this is recognised in any future funding. As recently as 2 weeks ago, the Isle of Wight County Press, Isle of Wight Radio, hosted a question-timed event with representatives of the Isle of Wight NHS, on which this issue of the island-mainland split in services was debated, and the view of my constituents was quite clear: the retention of services on the island where possible should be a priority. I would therefore urge the Minister to examine carefully the funding arrangements in place for healthcare to ensure that those needs are met. However, I would also ask that we look at funding for the island and how visits to the mainland are funded. And I would like to briefly turn to the issue of patient travel on this point. As I said, the Isle of Wight is the only UK island that has no subsidised ferry travel to support local residents in accessing specialised services on the mainland. I'm not going to dwell on arrangements for Scottish islands because they are part of a wider mechanism and are devolved. The National Health Service Travel Expenses and Remission of Charges Regulations 2003 sets out that any person who is a resident of the Isles of Scilly who is not entitled to payment in full of NHS travel expenses in accordance with low-income criteria will pay a maximum of £5 for their travel costs. As the CCG Kernow, Cornish CCG document sets out, residents of the Isle of Scilly only have to pay £5 towards the cost of NHS-funded patient transport to the mainland. Furthermore, it's deemed necessary to have an escort to accompany the patient, and in which case the maximum of £5 payment will be applicable in those circumstances as well. I've talked to my honourable friend who represents Scilly about this, the Scilly Isles about this. I'm delighted that the residents of the Isles of Scilly benefit from such an arrangement, but the question is why it is not made available to my constituents as well. Whilst those on the Isle of Wight, there are some people on the Isle of Wight who meet the narrow definition on being on low income and will benefit from having such costs met. But there are many other residents who have to go regularly, prostate cancer, 40 trips to the mainland, for example, who face difficulty in affording the often repeated costs associated with accessing healthcare treatment on the mainland. I believe it is inequitable, unfair for one set of English islands to enjoy such a benefit where others do not. And this for me is yet another example of why the Isle of Wight is not treated fairly. The current arrangements for Isle of Wight residents travelling to the mainland for operations and for medical appointments are much less generous and only exist due to the cooperation of our 3 cross-Solent operators. Red Funnel offer a special return ferry fare, Whitelink offer a discount on both vehicle and foot passengers plus a patient escort, and Hover Travel offers a 20% discounted ticket price on day return. I'm grateful to these operators for putting such arrangements in place and to the NHS on the Isle of Wight for negotiating them. But the reality is, even with such discounts, the cost of trips to access healthcare treatment on the mainland can place a very great financial burden, which I believe is at odds with the founding principles of the NHS being free at the point of delivery. Therefore, I return to the arrangements for the Isles of Scilly, and I would ask the Minister to seek amendments to the 2003 regulations to extend the statutory requirement to the Isle of Wight as well as to the Isles of Scilly. That would be a significant step forward and would have a great transformational effect on the lives of many of my constituents who go to the mainland for treatment. Currently, that is about 32,000 return visits a year. Under option 3, it would be about 30, and option 4 about 28, 27,000. But we are talking in the low tens of thousands, and these are relatively small amounts of money. I would also ask, however, that because those visits are in the tens of thousands, and because our CCG is struggling at the moment with the amounts of money it has, that any such arrangements do not have a budgetary impact, either on Cornwall CCG or on the Isle of Wight CCG, and that the cost of funding this discount comes directly out of the NHS budget. I think doing that recognises that English islands should be treated in a similar way to Scottish islands, and the costs of going to the mainland, be you in Scilly or be you in the Isle of Wight, should be recognised. And in this plan, all patients and their immediate escorts will pay no more than £5 for travelling to the mainland for treatment. And I believe this would be a fair and reasonable gesture for government to make, and I would ask that it be brought forward along with changes to the 2003 regulations to allow the Isle of Wight to benefit from statutory obligations. There's also then the issue of families travelling as well. In these circumstances, that one of my constituents staying overnight, that also includes financial pressure. And I appreciate that the 2003 regulations do not provide for such support. But if the minister would be generous enough to consider these changes and the small amounts of money that would come from directly funding the £5 fare for people seeking treatment, I could then go back with the minister and with the member who represents the Isles of Scilly. We could then go back to our respective ferry companies and see if they would be generous enough to make similar provision to those people who have to go and visit. So if you are in hospital in the mainland in Southampton and you come from Ventnor or Cowes or Ryde, you will then pay your £5 fee to get you over to that hospital, but your family are very often paying full whack on the ferries, and that is not cheap. And if we could change the arrangements, we could then go and talk to the ferry companies about providing support. It would have to be properly recognised and properly organised, but providing support to those families who then go and visit their loved ones in hospital. And I think this would, again, it would be a generous gesture. It would recognise that we are an island, both for the Scilly Isles and for ourselves. I'm very grateful for the Minister for listening to me in this debate, and I want to raise one other issue as well. So just to recap, we are not properly funded in my opinion, and I think we are very hard done by. My folks, my constituents are hard done by when it comes to travelling to the mainland. We love being an island, don't get me wrong, but we seek fair funding to mitigate the effects of the Solent, which I think is often overlooked by government. However, I am not just here to ask, I'm here to offer as well. And what we would like to do, we are committed on the island anyway to integrating health and social care as much as possible. And I believe that the island would be delighted with government support to lead the way to deliver best practice in integration of council, health and adult social care services. So, for example, we have the My Life a Full Life programme, a collaboration between the Isle of Wight CCG, the local NHS Trust and the Isle of Wight Council. This initiative works in partnership with local people, with voluntary organisations and the private sector to deliver a more coordinated approach to the delivery of health and social care for older people and people with long-term conditions on the island. My aim is to keep young people on the island as much as possible, to build an economy for them, to get a university, to improve our education system. But at the same time, it is critical that we become one of the leaders in ensuring quality of life in later life. And because we are naturally drawn towards integrating our services, because we are a small island, we have the potential to be a national leader in this. My Life a Full Life is a great idea, but it arguably hasn't reached where it should be going because we still have those siloed organisations. And there are bureaucratic hurdles to be overcome in combining leadership in those organisations and the full integration of those organisations, which could save a considerable amount of money in appointments, which can be then put back into the frontline services. I'd like to acknowledge here the work of all those involved on the island in delivering some really good programmes that we have in integration. So Councillor David Stewart, Councillor Claire Mosdell, along with professional officers such as Dr. Carol Tozer, the Director of Adult Social Care. They've established a local care board which is already bringing these services together as part of our One Public Services vision for the island. But it is still not combined structurally and in terms of leadership and in terms of governance. So at the moment, the government provides one pot of money to local government on the island, another one to the funding of the NHS Isle of Wight, another to CCG respectively. Does it have to be this rigid? Can we aspire towards a situation where you have one combined funding pot which is made available to public service provision on the island, and therefore increasing the requirement for a deeper and more meaningful integration? Such circumstances may require combining the governance and leadership of public services, and that is something which is important to explore, and there are questions there over the role of experts, certainly in healthcare provision and adult social care provision. But I would ask the Minister to explore with his ministerial colleagues whether there's an appetite for creating a unique public authority on the Isle of Wight which combines traditional local government functions with NHS Trust, with the CCG, adult social care, mental health services, etc. Such a fully combined and integrated approach can work anywhere. It should work on the island, and such a step would be a natural progression for us from the integrated way that we are trying to work, but we are trying to overcome these siloed and bureaucratic and financial hurdles. And clearly, if we were to achieve this, we would ensure that the input of healthcare professionals was still very much at the forefront of decision-making. And I would urge the Minister to work with us as closely as possible on this, if he would wish, because I think this could be a valuable exercise that could then be repeated elsewhere in maybe more isolated communities and in places where the combination of healthcare and the combination of public service could be in the real public good and public need. I will not talk for very much longer. I just want to make a couple of other points very briefly, and I'm grateful to the Chairman to allow me to speak at length. Digital solutions. Again, we're not the only part of Britain that's isolated, but clearly the Solent is a boundary and a border for us. And it seems to me that I find it slightly ridiculous that, yes, if you need to go to Southampton for an operation, that's great. But do you need to go to Southampton for every pre-op appointment? Do you need to go to Southampton or Portsmouth for every post-op appointment? We were talking about this earlier. We need to find the greatest centres of expertise in Britain and be able to buy those services in. So maybe you will have your appointment in Southampton or Reading or London or Portsmouth. But your pre-op using digital technology, using telemedicine, we need to be much more efficient in how we use this. Now again, we're not the only isolated part of Britain, but I'm offering the island to NHS England as a pioneer for not only integrated services, but also how we use advances in telemedicine and all these other wonderful things, and indeed data collection. I think the NHS doesn't use data terribly well, if I understand correctly. In data for preventative medicine, we are small enough to be manageable. Social scientists love us because we are geographically isolated, so where we are clearly, in a very geographically obvious way, measurable. And for relatively small amounts of money, a great deal of learning could be done on the use of data in preventative medicine, on telemedicine, on integration, on the combining of health and adult social care. So as well as saying, please look at our funding, because we have funding problems on the island, because we have special needs that have never, ever been recognised. And I find it shocking, frankly, that it seems to me that government, with the best will in the world, tries to be fair. And it funds the Scottish Islands via the Scottish government. It gives them extra money. Anglesea's got a bridge. The Scilly Isles, a very small population anyway. And yet government permanently functions without taking into account my constituency. And I know it doesn't mean to do that, but because of our unique circumstance, we are isolated by water, and that's never been recognised. When you look at isolation factors, we never seem to qualify. So we aren't properly funded. We'd like to be, and I'd like very much for the government to look at that. I would like government to look seriously at the struggle that some of the islanders have to actually pay for the travel to the mainland for when they go for treatment. And I would and I offer the government to suggest ways that you can use the island as a test case, as a national leader, to integrate services better, to use data better, and to combine all these functions using telemedicine to create a really world-class service on the island, which can be used not only to deliver great healthcare to my residents, but can be used as a national role model for others as well. Thank you very much.